I'm Vanessa Santos. I'm here with SME Oral History on March 2nd, 2022 to interview my close friend and colleague, Jessica Kogel. Jessica and I have known each other for more than 20 years, and we're both geologists and we're both in industrial minerals, so it's my pleasure to be here today. So Jessica, to start out with, we're going to start at the big beginning on way back when, on where you grew up and what was your intro into life.
My intro into life, wow. So I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, and at the time it was a very rural area, lots of farms, and also the nation's mushroom growing headquarters. It may still be, I don't know. So lots of mushroom houses. But you know, I think since I'm here as a geologist and somebody who eventually made my way into the mining industry, when I look back at where I grew up, I think it really maybe was kind of preordained that I would end up where I ended up. That's because I grew up on the White Clay Creek, and it was named the White Clay Creek because there was a lot of kaolin in the area. And there was a town actually named Kaolin, Delaware. I was in that little part of Pennsylvania that's sort of between, you know, there's that little kind of semicircle, and that's where Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland all kind of come together, just north of the Mason-Dixon line there. So there was also, and I grew up on one of those old dairy farms. My parents weren't working farmers, but they, you know, we were living there. And there was an old kaolin pit behind the farm. Actually behind our barn, and I used to play for hours in that kaolin pit, just absolutely loved it. And so I think where I grew up had something to do with where I ended up. So those were formative years. I learned to play in the mud.
So your parents were from the area?
No, actually they weren't. They were actually from the Midwest, and they moved east because they were aspiring painters. They were fine artists, and they finished their undergraduate degrees at the University of Missouri in Columbia, and then started east, heading towards New York, and to become artists. And then they started their family and moved to Pennsylvania because my father was had gotten a job at the, not at the University of Delaware, that was later, but at the Delaware Art Museum, where he was the curator. And so that's how we ended up there.
Okay. So that must have been great out there in the woods, in the nature, at the dairy.
In the nature, lots of nature around me. Yeah, I could mention that where I grew up, you can still go to today. It's the White Clay Creek Preserve, and it's about 2,000 acres of beautiful southeastern Pennsylvania woodlands. And the house that I grew up in is the house is no longer there, but the woods that I played in, and probably the kaolin pit, is even still there.
Because were they mining the clay?
No, I don't know why that pit was there. I have I've gone online and I've researched history books to see, but I can tell you that kaolin mining did take place there, commercial kaolin mining, and it was underground. And it was actually the only underground kaolin mine in the U.S., as far as I know. And I think that was back in the 1800s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's neat. So, all right, so that's a good start to get into geology. Right. So what else do you think kind of influenced you to that?
I had a lot of people that just, you know, were around me as I was growing up that took me to various places. For example, there was an old canal, and there were a number of brick factories that were along this canal because it was a great source of raw materials for making brick. So we would go to the brick canal because one of my parents' friends was an artist, and he actually made brick walls, and he would carve those brick walls into these beautiful sort of three-dimensional pieces that banks in the area, for example, would commission him to create for their lobby and that sort of thing. So my grandmother also had a real interest in rocks and minerals, and she did a lot with lapidary, and so she would take me out hunting for mineral specimens. And I would also go down to the basement with her and watch all that come out of her tumbler. And yeah, so I just had a number. Those are just some examples. But it just seemed that I was surrounded by a lot of people who kind of opened up this sort of whole side of life to me. And I was fascinated by it as a kid.
To look at everything that's around, all the natural things that are influencing to art, and then, of course, later on to influence to science.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it was really interesting for me because I did come from a family of artists, and I always sort of felt a little bit like a black sheep in the family. And my parents are artists. My brother is a photographer. All of my, it seems like all of my siblings and the people who were closest to me had some foot in the art world. And here I came along, and I was really interested in creativity and the art world, but I had this real fascination for the natural world and science. And so, I was influenced by both as a child, but eventually at some point I had to make a decision, which direction am I going to go?
But I think you and I have spoken before about how we think of geology as kind of being the creative science.
Exactly. Yeah, I think when I discovered geology as a discipline, and I'm sort of amazed that, I went off to college and knew I wanted to be a scientist. And actually, when I was in 6th grade, I think it was, I had decided that I was going to get a PhD. I didn't know in what. I didn't know exactly why.
PhD.
Right. And I've thought about that a lot. I thought, why in the world in 6th grade did I think I wanted a PhD? I think it's because I was influenced by friends of my parents who worked at DuPont at the experimental station. And one friend in particular would come to our home, and he would bring with him all sorts of kind of what I would describe as experiments that he would then share with us in our living room. And I became just fascinated by this whole process of science. And so...
Like what kind of experiment?
Oh, I remember him bringing these beakers, and there was like nylon, and he was pouring things into beakers and creating nylon. And he helped me with my science fair project. I did one on I made a heart that really pumped. A mechanical heart, that sort of stuff, So I thought I was going to go into biology. But that's where I kind of got the idea about science. But I didn't know geology as a discipline existed. So I go off to college, and my freshman year, first semester, somebody said to me, hey, you might want to take a geology class. And so I did, and loved it. And the rest is history.
So where was that?
So that was at Smith College, yeah. And I had just amazing professors there, and really stimulating. It was a really exciting place to be. Despite that, I only stayed there for 2 years and got pretty serious about geology after those 2 years, and knew that that was probably what I was going to go ahead and pursue, more advanced degrees in, because I just found it so inspiring. So, I was just kind of awestruck by geology and understanding the earth, how to read the earth. And I'm sure you went through a very similar sort of, transformation after you started getting into geology. So I transferred and left Smith and ended up at Berkeley. And so that's where I ended up doing my undergraduate, both in geology, and I also got a degree in paleontology.
And I think there were some pretty famous folk over there at Berkeley.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Berkeley was a really amazing place to be. As a geologist and as a student, there are a lot of Nobel laureates at Berkeley, and you sort of had a sense of, I'm walking around this campus of these really amazing, intellectuals that have had super impact on the world as we know it. And at the time that I was in the geology department there was a big controversy going on. This was right after Alvarez, it was a father-son, had come up with the asteroid impact hypothesis, the KT boundary.
Yes.
Yeah. And so
he was one of your professors.
He was one of my professors in the geology department. And then there was a separate paleontology department. And one of my other professors in the paleontology department was Bill Clemens. And Bill Clemens, while I was getting lectures from Walter Alvarez about the impact and the extinction of the dinosaurs and the iridium anomaly and the extinction, then the Professor Bill Clemens in the geology department was saying, no, that's not what happened. And he really was a very strong advocate for the opposite hypothesis, which was not that it was a catastrophic event, but it was a gradual event. And so it was really exciting to be in the department at that time and to hear this scientific debate. But it got even more interesting because my first summer, I guess after my sophomore year, I was looking for something to do for the summer. And I knew that Bill Clemens had a field crew that he took every summer out to Montana to collect dinosaur fossils out of the Hell Creek Formation. I thought, wow, that would be really exciting to do.
Exciting, yes.
So I approached him one day in his office, and I kind of knocked a little bit timidly, and because he was sort of this man of stature.
Famous guy,
right? I was this little lowly undergrad. So I knocked on his door and I said, Professor Clemens, I would really love the opportunity to come with you to Montana. Are you accepting members for your field crew this summer? And if you are, would you consider me? And he sort of sat there, and he had a beard, I remember, and he would sort of do this, kind of look at the window.
They all had beards.
Yeah. And he said, young lady, I was taking his class. Maybe he said my name, but I think he said, young lady, I don't take women into the field. I don't believe in that. And so I was so unprepared for that response. I thought I'd get maybe a yes or a no, my field crew is full or something like that. That my mouth, I think, hung open. Because I had never encountered a situation where, because I was a woman, there was this door that wasn't open to me, just by virtue of gender. And so I didn't respond. I just sort of walked away. And then a couple of weeks later, he caught me after class, and he said, stroking his beard, young lady, I've reconsidered. And I didn't know what he was referring to exactly at first. And he said, I will take you. And he said, but under one condition. I said, what's that? He goes, I need somebody to cook for the crew.
Oh, sweet.
And I said,
one of those, you must know.
I know how to cook. I said, okay. And he paid me to cook. And we lived on a ranch in Montana with a little, not a little wood stove. There was an old shepherd's cabin with a large wood stove. And I don't think we cooked on wood, but I don't remember it. Yeah. Maybe we did.
Stoked it every morning.
But I'd get up before everybody else, and I'd make the bacon and the eggs and the whole 9 yards. And I remember the first day I put the food out in front of him, and he eats his food, and he's like this, and he goes, young lady, what did you do to these eggs? So I come from the East Coast, and my parents were, they were cooks, and I had used, I don't know why, I brought herbes de Provence with me.
Because who wouldn't?
So I'm putting herbes de Provence. He'd probably never had that before. Anyway, out there. So that's what we did. But the point of this story is that I had the most amazing field season because he was working very closely with Jack Horner, also a very, very famous paleontologist. And that summer, we had Jack Horner come with his field crew to, so we worked together in the field. We were looking for, this is the same time, Jack Horner was first putting out this idea that dinosaurs were, maternal, and that they nested, and he'd been finding all the nests. So he came to our part of Montana to see if he could find some dinosaur nests. And so that's what we were going out and looking for with him, which was all very exciting.
Yes.
And then Walter Alvarez shows up, and there's this sort of Cold War going on, right?
Yes.
The reason Walter Alvarez was there is because he wanted to collect a sequence of samples through terrestrial sediments and look for the iridium anomaly at the KT boundary. And the Hell Creek Formation actually crosses the KT. Actually, I think the top of the Hell Creek is the KT. And so I was the one, because I was a geology student, that went out with Walter Alvarez to collect this KT boundary sample. And guess what they found? It was the first terrestrial sample with the iridium anomaly, because his whole...
At that location?
Yeah, in the world. And so I got to collect that with him, and that was very exciting.
Super exciting.
And then National Geographic is also on the scene because of Jack Horner's work and how that was kind of capturing the nation's imagination.
Yes.
And so I thought being a geologist was incredibly glamorous, you know. And then we had a helicopter flying in beer at one point because Jack Horner was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. He says, well, one thing, we don't have enough beer here. And so Anheuser-Busch or somebody flew in. It was crazy. So anyway, it was very, very, very exciting. And
some of the most famous geologists of the time.
yeah,
for
it was incredible. And it's pretty far away from mining, I have to say.
Yes.
But, you know, at the time, I was just sort of, whatever opportunities were in front of me, I was hoping to capture and
Yes.
and to just pursue them. And
So
that's what I did.
Provence can change everything.
That's right.
So he got over the fact that there was a war.
And he invited me back after that.
Oh, really? To
Yeah.
the next season?
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to do conversions slowly, I
Yes.
think. Yes. So you finished the field season.
Finished the field season, got to go back for at least one, maybe part of a second one after that. And then after that, I graduated, and then it was time to figure out where I was going to go to grad school.
What are we going to be when we
What are we
grow
going to be when we grow up? I've
Okay.
had so much fun so far, but what am I going to do next?
All right. So then how did that play out?
Yeah, so I had been in California for 4 years. I took a year off, and then
I'm gonna go there. What did you do in your
so I got my California residency so that I could go to Berkeley and not pay tuition, of course. I mean,
okay.
So I took some time off, and then I did the double major. So I ended up being there for 4 years, and decided that I'd learned California geology, but it was time to learn geology from another part of the country. So I did not apply to any graduate schools in the West. I didn't really know where I wanted to focus my my future in terms of being a geologist. Was I Softrock? Was I Hardrock? And you know, this reminds me, one of the things that I didn't get to say earlier that I wanted to mention about geology is I love the fact that geology is an inexact science that really invites creativity. And so for me, I knew I wanted to stick with geology in graduate school because it gave me a creative outlet, I should say, not outlook, but that too, as well as being, you know, very much embedded in science. And at the time, geology was going through a transition from being a descriptive science to a very quantitative science. And that really, I think, was important to me as well. So anyway, a little bit of a segue there, but I just wanted to bring that in. So I was very decided on geology, but the geology, like medicine or any other field, is a vast world, as you know. And so I could have gone into any of the number of different sub-disciplines. And so I figured I was a soft rock geologist, and that's where I wanted to really focus my efforts because of my interest in paleontology, historical geology, all of those sorts of things. So I applied to some soft rock geology schools, you know, that had a reputation for having really strong programs, but also broad programs, so that as I refined my interests, I could then pursue them at that school without having to transfer or something like that, because I didn't want to do that. So I applied to 3 different schools, and I went to the school that gave me the best financial package, and that was Indiana University in Bloomington. And so I made my way to Bloomington from Berkeley, which is a big shift.
That's a big shift.
Big shift. I loved the Bay Area. I loved being at Berkeley. It was a hotbed of all kinds of things,
Yes.
and I embraced all those things. And I moved to the Midwest and hadn't lived in the Midwest, though my parents are from the Midwest. So in a sense, it was like coming home, but it couldn't have been more different than living on either the East Coast or the West Coast.
Bloomington is not a big town.
It is not. This is true. Limestone country. Beautiful place. It was a difficult transition, though, you know, going from kind of a major metropolitan area to...
You knew no one there at the...
I really didn't. I had gone to interview, and I'd met a few people, and I went to Indiana's field camp.
Oh.
And I guess that's why I applied to Indiana, because I had such a fantastic experience in the Tobacco Root Mountains in Montana at Indiana's field camp that I thought, well, I'm going to apply there for school, because there must be something good at that school, because they have such a great field camp. So off I went, and I started taking classes in various, well, mostly P-Chem and things like that. I didn't get to take too much geology right away, but then eventually I made my way around to geology. And one of the courses I took was clay mineralogy with John Drosty. And I took that because one of my professors at Berkeley was Richard Hay, who'd worked a lot in Olduvai Gorge with the leakies. And he was the one that introduced me to clay minerals. And I was really, really interested in clay minerals and weathering of, hard rock to produce clay minerals. So I took that class, and then Hayden Murray was also, he would be a guest lecturer. He was the chairman of the department at the time. And eventually I became one of Hayden Murray's many PhD students. He had a large group of students at the time, and I think there were 9 of us between his PhD students and his master's students. And so that's really when I started. Well, still, I didn't really know much about mining, quite honestly. But I think that was sort of the choice. Making the choice to become his PhD student is sort of what put me on track.
I mean, and Dr. Murray at that time was going everywhere, working for the mining company.
Exactly. So he had, at that time, left Georgia Kaolin Company. He was, I think, executive vice president at the time, had really strong connections in the industry, was very, very well respected. And then once he came to IU, they kind of brought him in as chairman. And he continued with his consulting for all the various companies that he had interactions with when he was at Georgia Kaolin Company. I think he was there for 17 years.
And worldwide.
And worldwide. Yeah, he worked all over the world. So he really opened that world up to his students. And he was just such a generous person. I mean, I think kind of he really felt that his career had been so successful and he had had so many rewards, and he wanted to share those, and he wanted to share them with his students. And so he was just incredibly generous with all of us, and he made sure all of us had an opportunity to share in the consulting, to meet all of the industry people out there in industrial minerals. And so as soon as I was finishing my PhD, I was getting phone calls from many of the companies, because they, if you were a Hayden Murray student, you always had an interview, because we were well trained in his laboratory.
Yes, because he had a full running laboratory there.
Yeah.
So what kind of clays did you specialize in for your PhD?
Yeah, so my PhD, I focused on bentonite. And I was really fascinated by bentonite. My field area was Montana and South Dakota and Wyoming. And so I worked on the Wyoming bentonite, looked at one of the bentonites in particular that's one of the marker beds. It's a Cretaceous bentonite. And it's one of the most commercially produced of the bentonite beds in that region of the United States for sodium bentonite. And I looked at the I wanted to understand the origin of that bed and what happened geologically to result in these really widely dispersed sodium bentonites, because you don't find sodium bentonite really anywhere else in the world, and particularly not of that quality. So something unique had to have happened. And so I looked at oxygen isotope chemistry, rare earth element chemistry, trace elements. I also looked at the physical properties. I was really interested in understanding how the physical properties of the montmorillonite then translated, well, actually, I should say it the other way around, how the fundamental properties of the mineral then translated into the physical properties. So I was really interested in how the chemistry of a particular strata then related to its end use and its application. So that was sort of, it's very much in the field of applied clay mineralogy, if you want to get really specific.
Yes.
And so once I finished my PhD, I then, once I got into the profession, started working in other minerals as well. But, my really first I'll say my first true love. It sounds really strange, right?
We love clay.
I love smectite. I love montmorillonite. But yeah, it's just fascinating material.
Yes.
Really fascinating material.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's almost for the industrial minerals, nothing so complex or so challenging as
exactly
as the clays.
Very complex, very challenging. I mean, just even something as simple as identifying which clay mineral you're working with.
Yes.
You know, you get into these weird mixed layer clay materials. I mean, so many. I mean, it's a fascinating field, and the fact that you can take these minerals and then use them in so many different end applications.
Yes.
You know, whether it's ceramics, fiberglass, paper, the list goes on and on. Plastics. I mean, we can spend the next 5 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, and that just makes them, to me, really, really, really interesting materials and easy to spend a lifetime pursuing. You know, better knowledge and understanding of them, and then using that knowledge to create new products, which is kind of what I ended up doing.
Yes. Yes.
And processes as well.
Yes. All right. So you did transition to industry.
I did.
How did that go?
It was really interesting. So I started out in a consulting company in Chicago, McCrone. You may have heard of McCrone. And they hired me because crystalline silica at the time, respirable crystalline silica, was just sort of hitting the streets as something that was, you know, we need to be thinking about. You know, it was a known carcinogen, and companies were really trying to understand how much crystalline silica was in their product. And as you know, quartz is the main form of crystalline silica, and of course quartz is ubiquitous. So really everybody had to be concerned about this, and particularly the industrial minerals folks. Those producers, you know, were basically, many of them were mining just quartz. So you know, obviously they had to understand the health impacts, and they had to understand how do we measure it accurately and all those sorts of things. So I was hired by McCrone to set up their laboratory and their program for testing crystalline silica in bulk materials, basically, whether it was soil, it could be industrial mineral product, really anything that you could grind up into a powder form and put into an X-ray diffractometer.
And I just want to point out that your paper on the identification, is still one of the real go-to. I mean, this was incredible. I mean, this is how it's done, essentially.
Yeah.
The way you did that. Yeah,
and it was really exciting work. You know, it felt groundbreaking, and I remember going to conferences and presenting, and I remember the debates, and it sort of reminded me of the Alvarez-Clemens debates, right? And there's debates wherever you go, I guess, in science. But it was an exciting time, and I remember after about 3 years of being at McCrone thinking to myself, this is exciting, but I want to do something different. I don't want to be in consulting. I felt frustrated. I felt like I was never really able to be on the inside of a problem. I was always just providing partial solutions. And oftentimes companies create, you know, that's how they treat consultants, or they don't want to give them the whole picture. And I wanted to have a bigger picture because I thought I could contribute more. And so I wanted to work directly for the industry. And so at that time I started, you know, looking for opportunities to do that. And I talked to Hayden Murray and asked him to kind of let me know if he knew of anything out there.
Yeah.
And he did. And there was a job at Thiele Kaolin Company in Georgia. And, you know, at the time we're living in Chicago and have a young family. And loved Chicago and had just a great life there. And the idea of moving and uprooting the family and going to Georgia was difficult.
And not just Georgia, but
very, very rural
Georgia.
You know well.
Yes.
And so I went and interviewed for the job, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, this is the perfect job for me. This is what I've trained for. And I loved so many things about the South too. The weather, the scents, the landscape, the history. The food, you know, the barbecue.
Yes. Shrimps.
I loved all that. And I remember leaving the interview and just crying because I was just like, what am I going to do? I have to uproot my family. And so I turned the job down, actually.
Really?
I did. Yeah. I just thought, I can't do this right now. And they were very patient with me. And about a year later, they called me and they said, are you still interested in the job?
Whoa.
And another year of water had gone under my bridge.
Yes.
And I was still doing crystalline silica
Yes.
analysis, and I was still feeling that itch to
Yes.
get to something different. And I thought, okay, it's decision-making time, and can we do this? And we did it.
Yes.
And we, the way we did it, we said, we can do anything for a year.
Exactly.
We'll move to Georgia for a year. It'll be a stepping stone, and then we'll go off and we'll do something else. 35 years later, we're still in Georgia.
It's a different world, but it's a cool.
It's a great place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been really happy there. Yeah, so I might do another little Hayden Murray segue here in mining, because I don't think you've asked me, and maybe you're going to, but I'm going to ask the question of myself.
Yes.
Mining. So I came into mining through Hayden Murray, as I said, but there was a very specific incident that led to it. And we might talk about this later when we talk about professional societies too. But it was really, when I was one of his PhD students, I came into my office. We each had a desk in the laboratory. And there was this magazine sitting on my desk, and it said mining engineering on it. And then there was an application for membership. And I'm like, mining engineering? What is mining engineering? What is this? Why would I apply for this? I had no idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
What is mining engineering?
What is mining engineering? And I'm a geologist.
Yeah.
What do I have to do with that? And so I looked around, and everybody had one of these on their desk. And I thought, okay. And where did this come from? Why is it here? So I went to Dr. Murray's office down on the first floor and knocked on his door and said, did you put this on my desk, and can you tell me a little more about it? And he said, yeah, you should fill that out and I'll pay for it. And that's all he said.
Okay.
And I left, and I thought, well, when Hayden Murray speaks, you do.
Yes. I mean, in retrospect, again, I mean, for students to be in professional organizations.
Exactly.
Is
Yeah.
an important thing.
It is. And I didn't know this at the time, of course. So I went up back to my office and did what he instructed me to do. And I didn't ask any more questions about it. And I thought, well, he's giving me this advice. I'm going to follow it. He knows better than I do.
So teachable.
And he's paying for it. So what does it matter? So I fill it out. And then the next thing I know is, I don't know, I started getting the magazine. It took a couple months. It didn't happen right away. This was back in the old days when you mailed things, and you didn't, I think we had fax then, but anyway. So eventually I get my first mining engineering magazine. I don't even know if it was called that then. And it was the issue that has the president's interview in it and the picture of the incoming or new president, and it was Hayden Murray. And I was like, well, who knew?
I know this guy.
And then I'm like, maybe that's why he wanted us to be in this organization. And then soon after that, I got this thing called the Blue Book. Do you remember the Blue Book?
No.
So years ago, if you were on a committee at SME, they had this thing called the Blue Book, and it listed all of the committees and the names of the people who were the committee members, as well as the chair and blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
So I got the Blue Book, and I thought, why am I getting this? And I started going through, and it was, it's not a phone book thick, but, it was a Sandersville phone book thick. Sandersville, Georgia is not a big town. But anyway, I started going through it, and my name's in there for this committee, and it was the Student Member Affairs Committee. And I'm like, I've never been to a meeting. I myself am a student. I've been assigned to a committee. How did that happen? And I just thought, well, I've got to go to the meeting.
Yes, the way of the world.
And it was probably 86 or 7. I don't remember what year he was president, but somewhere in that time frame. And that meeting was in Salt Lake City, where we are today.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yep. And so I flew into Salt Lake City, went to the Student Member Affairs Committee meeting, met George Luxbacher for the first time. I remember meeting George, who now he and I work together. And there were many other people around that table. Let me see, who else? I can see faces, but names aren't coming to me at the moment. They will, though. When they do, I'll come back to it. But anyway, and I was a little timid and a little bit sort of trying to feel my way and understand what it was all about, but I got involved in that committee. That led to involvement in other committees, and when they see a volunteer that's actually going to volunteer, suddenly you have all these things, landing in your lap. And I was sort of maybe naive enough to
meeting people and yes,
to start, accepting my volunteer invitations. And
I think it still works that way. You get put on the committee.
Definitely does. Or if you don't show up for the nominating committee, you definitely get put on the committee.
That's right.
And so before I know it, after many, 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 many years, I got more and more involved in SME, and I learned what a mining engineer was. I started figuring out what mining is. Mm-hmm. I started working for a mining company, and then it took me a number of years before I felt completely at home in that profession. But people really always supported me. They embraced me. They welcomed me. They mentored me. Even in the mines. And when I first came to Georgia, there was a little bit of, I was thinking about, okay, here's this woman, I'm coming to this rural part of Georgia, I'm working in an industry that's male-dominated, mm-hmm. and really still is. It's much better now than it was then, but I come into this company that's family-owned, and in some ways old-fashioned, and in other ways, I would say even leading edge. But I was really concerned about how I was going to fit in there, both professionally and socially. They'd never hired a woman at my level in the organization who had was there for a technical role, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I knew I was kind of paving the way at the company, and Thiele was just a wonderful company to work for, and it was sort of like a family, and they really wanted their new employees to see all aspects of the business. So my first 3 months at the company, I spent rotating to every single department in the company.
Good
and
deal.
working in those departments,
Yes.
which was fantastic.
Yes.
And so I was out in the mining department, I was in the exploration department, in the lands department, I was with the finance folks, marketing. And then I was, of course, out in the plant. And I remember being out in the plant and going out there, and this one guy going to the control room for my first day of my tour of duty in the plant. And I go into the control room, and this guy kind of looks at me, and he kind of sizes me up, and he goes, "I heard you have more degrees than a thermometer."
That's Georgia speak now.
And I said, "Well, yes, sir, I guess so." Meanwhile, he's sitting where you are, right? Mm-hmm. And over him is this calendar. You know what's on the calendar, right? Ubiquitous calendar that was in every control room. And I'm looking at him, and I'm looking at the calendar, and I'm like, all right, how's this relationship going to go? Well, he warmed up to me pretty quickly, and we had a great relationship. And my time at Thiele, which I think I was there, I've lost count of exactly how many years, but it was close to 15.
Wow.
And I just felt comfortable in that company wherever I went. And I think people, I had credibility because
Yes.
I'd rotated through all those departments.
Right.
And
Yes,
I built
perfect.
these relationships,
Yes.
and people were willing to accept me.
And then I guess, essentially bringing something to the table, which
Yeah.
maybe they didn't have before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I still was the only woman. I remember many, many, many meetings where I was the only woman in the meeting, and that was true at SME too. And so
Yes.
that was sometimes a little bit of a challenge for me, but I learned to have a voice, and I learned to be in those rooms and make sure that I was able to, like I say, have a voice and make contributions. That was most important to me. And sometimes that meant listening, sometimes that meant being, very outspoken about things.
So besides SME, what about some of the other, to see the benefit of getting that, what other professional organizations?
So I have been involved in several. SME, the longest, I would say, as well as the Clay Minerals Society. That's a much smaller organization, mostly academics and professionals and government I would say, constitute the membership of that organization. And it's very much focused on clay mineral science and applied clay mineralogy and that sort of thing.
Continuing education.
Yeah. And so both, I would say those are the two main organizations that have been the backbone of my professional life. There are other organizations that I've been involved in as a member. AIPG is another example, but I didn't really get as involved in those organizations from a volunteer and leadership perspective as I did in SME and the Clay Mineral Society.
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, so you were there at Thiele for that many years, but then you decided you needed a change?
I did, yeah. So after about 15 years, I was in the research and development department. I was working on developing new processes, new products, as I alluded to earlier. A lot of really interesting things. I got to patent some processes and just a lot of really rewarding experiences throughout. But at some point I got that itch again. And I thought, okay, I've spent 15 years in kaolin. And kaolin is a fascinating mineral, but I wanted more. And I wanted an experience that not only exposed me to new minerals, but to other parts of the world. Thiele had North American operations. They had some small satellite operations in Europe, but that was about it. So it was somewhat of a more constrained experience, let me put it that way, than what I really wanted for my next part of my profession. I kind of reached that mid-profession point where I wanted something that was broader. So I went over to Imerys. And Imerys is also a kaolin mining company in Georgia, but they do much more. It's a publicly held company headquartered in France. I don't know how many minerals today they mine, but it's all of the industrial minerals all over the world. Yes. And I can't quote the statistics anymore because I was with Imerys up until 6 years ago, or 7 now. Actually, it's been 7 years since I left Imerys. And I was with Imerys for about 13 years, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. And so while I was at Imerys, I got to get involved in other minerals, and I got to go to other parts of the world. And that was something that I was looking for. So I was kind of broadening my experience, and really, for me, it was taking my expertise that I developed and using it to do greater and greater sort of good, have more and more impact. Because I think ultimately, when I think back to that 6th grader who wanted a PhD, at that point, I don't know who was that little girl. I wanted a PhD because I wanted to have impact. I wanted to do something. I wanted to change the world. I mean, I had this sort of desire, and maybe that goes back to watching the astronauts land on the moon or something. I don't know. And I really wanted that, and I knew I needed to sort of have these experiences that reached kind of new territory for me personally, to give me the stimulation, but also to allow me to take knowledge I developed and use it in other areas. And that's what Imerys gave me, and it really stretched me in ways that I don't know that I would have elsewhere. And also I had just really tremendous experience and a lot of very rewarding experiences there, but then the itch happened again.
Yes.
And so once the itch started, I started looking around, thinking, okay, I'm on the home stretch of my career, and this is sort of the last maybe 10 years, and what do I want to do with my capstone? And that's really how I looked at it. The capstone that would then maybe turn into the landing pad for retirement. And so I got this phone call. I was kind of looking around, and I was talking to different headhunters, and just sort of trying to establish what I wanted next.
Yes.
Honestly.
Right. Yeah.
What's out there?
There's an idea.
What would I like to see for my next part of my life, and where can I contribute the most? It had to be a good fit. And so I got this phone call, and it was a SME member, and this is where professional networking becomes so important.
Yes, so important.
One of our past presidents, who's now a dear friend, called me and he said to me, "Would you consider a job with the federal government?" And I said, "Well, I've never really thought about that before, but I'm all ears, tell me about it." And so we spent the next 45 minutes or so talking about this opportunity. And he said, "Well, it's a high-level position, and it's, would be focused on health and safety, occupational health and safety." And it was the associate director for mining at NIOSH. And, I knew the position well because I had known Jeff Kohler, who had it previous to me. And so, I knew Jeff also through SME, and I knew NIOSH just because everybody knows NIOSH if they're, especially if they're doing crystalline silica and the kind of work I'd been doing through most of my career. And so I said, I'm interested enough to learn more about this. And
they
so,
were after you. I mean, you were bringing industry experience,
Yes.
research experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and incidentally, I just finished coming off I just finished as president
And
of.
we're going to talk about that.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll put that aside then. So I learned more and more about this government opportunity, and I thought, wow, there's something really unique about the government that I didn't experience in the private sector, and that is, and it was the timing was just right for me, that I could go to the government and do science for social good. And I was in a place where that was really what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do science to, for better profit, which is sort of how it started to feel in the private sector.
Yes.
Not that had been my experience the whole time, and it hadn't.
But companies do evolve.
But that's sort of how things work, right?
Yes.
And you have your quarterly budget meetings, and budget became more and more and more. And I was overseeing a lot of mining operations, and I had a big budget for that because of all the overburden stripping and all that stuff.
Yes.
And then and I was also doing all of the reserve reporting, and I was trying to make sure we were mining our reserves for long-term sustainability. And when you run up against a short-term budget, then sometimes there's conflict there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, I'm going to give this government thing a go. And I knew occupational health and safety because I had been practicing it. We do every day in the mines.
Yes.
And so I felt very comfortable in that arena. I felt fairly comfortable in the government only because my husband was a retired federal government employee. Still is. I shouldn't have said was. He's still retired. He's still alive. That's actually fun. Still my husband. And so I'd kind of lived through all of his trials and tribulations and all the good things and the bad things that come with a government job.
Which is good to go into with your eyes wide open.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd heard his stories and I knew what he'd gone through. And so I felt really well positioned to go into that kind of environment and be successful.
And at that higher level, it is almost like you can have a bigger impact.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and that's exactly right. And I really, for the first time in my whole life as a professional, felt that every day I was going to work doing something that saved people's lives and doing something that improved people's quality of life. And, by protecting them in the workplace. And so it's been just a fabulous place to be. It's such a good fit for me. I think everything that happened before led me to this place.
Yes.
And I just landed in it sort of because somebody else saw that I could be a fit for it. I didn't see it. I didn't. And that's sort of been the story of my life. I haven't always had the confidence or the self-awareness to see how I can fit into something where other people have, and they've sort of urged me in a direction, and I've always had the sense to listen.
Yes.
And to, consider, I wouldn't, if Hayden Marie told me to go out and shoot somebody, I wouldn't have done that. Yes. I would apply to SME though, to become a member. But you know, I always listened, and I took these suggestions seriously, and I think that was really important for me. And so I've had just
and again, the benefit of the government. I mean, they're benefiting from all that you could bring to the table, which might have been not the case of someone who'd been there forever or something like that. So.
Yeah, I think I brought a fresh look at things because for my particular position, the people in the past who have been in that position or in that role have been mining engineers. I'm a geologist. So I have a slightly different way of looking at things. But, you know, let's face it, all of the occupational safety and health hazards, all of the risk comes from the geology.
That's
you know?
right. Yes.
It's the minerals that you're breathing. It's the geology and the competence of the rock that determines whether or not you're going to have a roof fall. So it all comes back to geology in the end. Yes. And so from that perspective, even though they haven't had geologists in the past, a geologist is very well suited for the role. The other thing that I did bring to it was the industry experience and industrial minerals.
And a worldview.
And a worldview, yes. And industrial minerals, I think, was important because NIOSH, up until fairly recently, has really focused, particularly at the Pittsburgh Research Division, on coal. As we know, coal in this country has undergone a significant transformation. There are many fewer coal mines, fewer coal miners, still major occupational health and safety sorts of challenges for us to deal with, particularly amongst the retired coal miners.
Yes.
But NIOSH as a research organization needed to really start pivoting the research away from coal and into other fields. And so industrial minerals is one that really works in that, kind of as something to pivot towards. So really metal, non-metal in general. But, every state has an aggregates quarry, right?
Right.
And so...
And all different kinds.
All different kinds.
Yes. Yeah. Underground, surface, gravel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think all of those things made it a good fit for me and where I could really bring some value.
I mean, even the coal part of it has changed with more out-of-sea mining and different deposits that they're looking at and things like that.
Yeah, and I think right now we're seeing a huge transition. It's right upon us right now with the energy transition.
For sure.